This trial is about George Zimmerman, not about pictures of ice cream cones or... Now, I still think the joke was funny. I'm sorry about that. I'm sorry I didn't tell it better, but there was an important reason for it. There needed to be a disconnect, frankly, a disconnect from an act that was hard to follow. But I knew, Mr. O'Meara knew, and you all soon found out that it was indeed just an act. I couldn't follow that act with that kind of passion and glaring and staring and all of that. We needed facts. Unlike what Ms. Corey said, they brought the facts. They didn't. Anybody that watched this trial knew the defense put on the case. We proved George Zimmerman was not guilty. So, no, I won't talk about that. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Ben Montgomery, Tampa Bay Times. Can you give us any insight into Mr. Zimmerman's state of mind upon hearing the verdict?
I don't know exactly how you can feel when you're in trauma and stress for 16 months. And he's very, very happy with the result, obviously. There's just a release that happens, an emotion release, and endorphin release, and adrenaline release. I think it's probably going to settle on him tonight when he's with his family and can actually realize that he doesn't need to come back to the courthouse tomorrow or ever again unless he wants to under his own free will. So I think he's going to be great. I think he's still worried, and hopefully everyone will respect the jury's verdict as they should, and most have said they would, and we'll take it day by day. But he's doing good.
This is Grace Wong with In Session. I know this is a yes or no question, but I want you to expand on it after I ask the question. Was this a fair fight for you? Let
me say it this way. I need to apologize to every public defender in the state. And for this reason, because I said that the way that we were treated in the discovery process and the fights that we had to go through made me think, thought they were dealing with a couple of young, overworked public defenders, insulted public defenders. And I learned from public defenders, I was a prosecutor, that I learned from. So to the extent there, I apologize. What I meant to say was that it seems prosecution is used to getting away with some of what, with the enormous demands they put upon us to try and get discovery that in 30 years of experience, on the table right up. It was a fight that we had to fight. They made it extraordinarily difficult. If only we had the time back to fight for the stuff, the information, discovery, result for 6 months ago, and certainly I wouldn't have had the hundreds and hundreds of hours wasted in a situation where they never should have made us waste time. Was it fair? It was a little bit David and Goliath, but we won.
Danny Morales with the Valencia Voice here. George had a very good poker face on when the verdict came in. At what point did he express his gratitude to you and how excited he was to finally be able to go home?
I think per what we discussed with him beforehand, it was after everyone sort of left the room when you can actually show a little bit more emotions. You just, when you have an emotional outpouring like that, sometimes you get that on a camera or something like that. It's not really what you want to see. But he certainly thanked us, obviously, and I think he was able to finally emote as it became a realization that he truly is done.
Hi, Lisa Lucas, New York Daily News. I'd like to ask you what you feel was your best moment and your weakest moment, and ask the same of you to.
When they said not guilty. I think that was probably my moment.
I agree with that.
So that's during the trial. If you haven't heard of trial hypnosis, I'll explain it to you. I absolutely believe that every time I opened my mouth, it was a great moment. Nobody else thought so, but I always did. So it was the whole. It's a trial. It's where we live. It's like a surgeon being in surgery. It's where you want to be. It's what you want to do. So I would. Everything that we did, purpose and a plan. Every motion we filed, every argument we made. It's just decent trial lawyers.
Lisa Lampkin, NBC News.
Hello,
Mark,
Lisa.
I have a couple legal questions. One is, speaking about the state attorney's office, now that you've gotten the not guilty verdict you wanted, are you still going to pursue the sanctions, number one? And then second of all, hopefully not upsetting your wife, because I'm sure you're going to need a vacation, but how are you going to address the civil aspect of this now, as far as the stand your ground and keeping George Zimmerman from being liable.
Sure. As to the first, yes, there's a sanctions hearings to be set. There is not only that, but of course the state is then responsible for a lot of the costs that we've incurred to acquit George Zimmerman. So we're going to have a hearing on that as well. So yeah, we're not quite done yet. And on the civil aspect, if someone believes that it's appropriate to sue George Zimmerman, then we will seek and we will get immunity in a civil hearing. And we'll see just how many civil lawsuits will spawn from this fiasco. So,
Finn Gomez with Fox News. Mr. O'Meara, Mr. West, what happens to, I know this seems like a kind of a basic follow-up, but what happens now to Mr. Zimmerman? Are we going to hear from him? What does he do now? Where does he go? Like, what's next for your client?
I don't know what you do after 16 months of this. I'm really not sure. I think you need to just go somewhere, relax, get your bearings back. I think that he would like to, once he settles in, let you know who he really is, since that couldn't be told except through us, and even in that way, quite limited. But I'm sure that if he could wave his magic wand, he would just sort of get his life back. And I know that always brings up the idea of the life that's lost forever, and I'm not comparing the two, but now that the jury decided that he acted properly in self-defense, maybe we can give him a little bit of that understanding as well, that he now needs to get on with his life after having suffered several traumas.
Hello, sir.
Hi.
I have a two-part question, Molly. Hennessy Fisk with the LA Times. The first part is the prosecution raised this question about whether the outcome would be different if the races of the defendant and the victim were different. Do you think it would have been different if George Zimmerman was black? And the other part of my question is, does he fear for his safety? Have precautions been made surrounding his security?
Well, I think that the things would have been different if George Zimmerman was black for this reason. He never would have been charged with a crime. It seems as though what happened was an event that was being looked into by Sanford Police Department, and quite honestly, as we now know, looked into quite well. I have taken advantage of police departments who have not done a good investigation of crimes, because that's what I do for a living. When I looked at the Sanford Police Department investigation, they had done quite a good job, and you can compare what they did across the country to see who does good or bad jobs with their investigation, but they were doing quite a lot. What happened was this became a focus for a civil rights event, which again is a wonderful event to have, but they decided that George Zimmerman would be the person who they were to blame and sort of use as the creation of a civil rights violation, none of which was borne out by the facts. The facts that night was not borne out that he acted in a racial way. His history is a non-racist, and you know all the anecdotes about the mentees and the children living in his home when he was young and the Sherman Ware incident. So if only those who decide to condemn Mr. Zimmerman as quickly and as viciously as they did would have taken just a little bit of time to find out who it was that they were condemning, it would never have happened. And it certainly wouldn't have happened if he was black, because those people who decided that they were going to make him the scapegoat would not have. And I'm sorry? She did have a two-part question.
All right. I'll ask her question because I wanted to ask that too. First of all, is he, how concerned is he? Is he going to sort of stay in hiding for a while and sort of feel it out and see what happens? And then the second question is, I've never seen jurors thank defense attorneys for giving them instructions on the law before, as what happened to you during jury selection. My jaw dropped open. What was your reaction when they thanked you for explaining the law?
As to the first question, yes, he has to be very cautious and protective of his safety, because there is still a fringe element who have said, at least in tweets and everything else, that they want revenge, that they will not listen to a verdict of not guilty, although I think everyone in this room would agree this was a very fair trial, more fair to the state maybe on occasions than to the defense, but certainly it was a fair enough trial in that the state got to present everything that they could. So in that sense, those people who have their anger, they're just going to have it because they're angry people, not because it's based in fact. Can't help that, but we do need to be worried about it. Second question, I mentioned it earlier. Everything I do, I think, is done well. I don't remember a juror actually verbalizing thank you to me when I'm trying to help them understand an area of law that, as we talked about, is utterly unique. And we drag them in off the street and ask them to take on our mantle of how we work our lives in these courtrooms and to do it well. But maybe I'll take that as a compliment that they were listening. And obviously, they got an opportunity to put that in practice with their verdict.
For Don West, Michael Lanos, HLN. You had to cross-examine Rachel Gentel and Dr. Bao. Did you relish the challenge, or was it a nightmare?
No question it was a challenge. What I think we needed to establish with Ms. Gentel, while it took several hours to accomplish, and there were those challenges within that itself, we showed through her testimony when the phone call, the second to last phone call ended with Trayvon Martin. What was it? 7:12:48, something like that, 7:11:48. And when the next one started, and then when the event itself occurred. Through that testimony, corroborated by the phone records, we could show, as Mr. O'Mara clearly pointed out in closing, there were 4 minutes. There were 4 minutes in between the time when Trayvon Martin ran off until he reappeared and the confrontation with George Zimmerman occurred. As well, the circumstances under which Ms. Gentel was asked to answer questions were extraordinarily challenging for her. My goodness, she wanted to be left alone. She didn't volunteer anything until she was pulled out of this. And the first interview she gave was with the family lawyer, with the family present on the other end of the phone. It was an interview made for TV, not for law enforcement, that was then followed by an interview with the state attorney's office on April 2nd under the most extraordinary circumstances. It took place in Ms. Fulton's living room with Ms. Fulton sitting next to Ms. Gentel. That set the stage for the witness herself saying, I was uncomfortable. I changed my testimony to really to accommodate the feelings of Ms. Fulton. That was the setting for all of this. Plus, as Mr. O'Mara pointed out, she really didn't want to be there. Was that a challenge? Of course it was. But I think ultimately, when you distill it to its important parts, that we did accomplish ultimately what we wanted. As to Dr. Bao, did you hear Dr. DeMaio's testimony? Much of my cross-examination of Dr. Bao was to set the stage for that, indicating where they would clearly disagree, trying to identify why and how they would disagree, and then offering, I think, perhaps the foremost expert in the country on the very issue we had in our case.
Hi, Valerie Boy, Fox 35 News. 2 questions. Do you think the judge was fair or unfair to you? And my other question is, do you think this verdict will hurt race relations?
Judge Nelson runs her courtroom very well, and she moved this case along at a pace that I appreciated. Obviously, we were asking for motions to continue along the way, not because of her timeline as much as because of the state's concerns over discovery. So it turns out we were able to accomplish what we needed to in the time she gave us. Within the context of the courtroom herself, as I mentioned a couple of times, I appreciate that she reminds me when I do things like speaking objections or somehow no comes out of my mouth. And that's okay. She needs to run a strict courtroom. And I think that she did. So I sort of appreciate that. And I'm okay with that. We certainly had some concerns over the rulings as they occurred, but we respect them as the rulings they are. You had a second part to that?
Do you think this verdict will affect race relations?
I kept saying a year ago that I really hope that they don't. I kept suggesting to Mr. Crump on 3 separate occasions that we not suggest that this is a civil rights case of the century, because it's just not. It was a self-defense case. Did it bring to the forefront the conversation that, young black males are treated a certain way in the criminal justice system? Absolutely. Is that positive? Absolutely. Do we need to have that conversation? Absolutely. However, if portending that conversation on top of the Zimmerman verdict is going to affect our ability to have that conversation, shame on them, because that conversation needs to be had. And now it may not be had because we have sort of artificially separated the two camps, if you will, over this verdict. This verdict still has nothing to do with civil rights. Civil rights needs to be talked about, but not in the context of the George Zimmerman verdict.
George Howell with CNN. This question specifically to you, Mr. West. As far as the relationship with the judge, the back and forth, can you talk to us just a bit about that? Do you feel that you were getting fair treatment? And a second question that's similar to both of you. What do you say regarding the tension? What do you tell people who've dug in on one side or the other?
I'd like to keep my bar license for a couple more years. And the second part of the question?
The second part of the question was, what do you tell people? This has become, people have watched around the country and have dug in on either side of this. What do you tell people, just given the tension that could follow this verdict?
That's been such a challenge for me. Obviously, while I've tried a number of cases over the last 33 years or so, a number of them with extremely high stakes, death penalty cases. Nothing, of course, like this with the media attention. Nothing that had the case tried over and over and over again in the media. Nothing where the media was accused of such irresponsibility early on, frankly, being swept along with this narrative that's simply been shown not to be true. To me, as a trial lawyer, that was an incredible distraction because I like to, in fact, the only place I can try a case is in the courtroom, and I think we did that. So I don't know how to respond.
Yes.
Jackie Goddard for the Times of London and the Daily Beast. You mentioned about George wanting to get his life back. There's one person who's not going to. Have you got any words for Trayvon Martin's family?
They suffered a tragedy. I've acknowledged that to the family on 3 previous occasions. Nothing can bring back Trayvon Martin. Every time any life is lost, particularly a young life, it's a tragedy. We hear about it in car accidents. We hear about it with cancer. I lost a 13-year-old niece to cancer. We hear about it constantly, and it's always a tragedy. But I'm not going to shy away from the fact that I think that the evidence supported that George Zimmerman did nothing wrong and that he was battered and beaten by a 17-year-old who, for whatever reason, and we won't know, thought that he had to lash out and attack violently. And it turned out that all of the forensic evidence supports that. None of it supports that George was ever the aggressor, certainly not legally, and I don't believe morally. So did that end up leading to the tragic loss of life? Yes. Could it have been avoided? Yes. When it really came down to it, 45 seconds before the gunshot, when George was getting battered, I still believe that that decision was in Trayvon Martin's hands more than my client's. And as I mentioned, they get my greatest sympathies for their tragic loss of their son. No one should ever have to suffer losing a child, ever. But it happens much more than we're willing to acknowledge sometimes or that we want to admit. This is a tragedy like many other loss of children. It's just not one that George was responsible for.
Ty Wright, Valencia Voice. When the jury asked for clarification on the instructions regarding manslaughter, was there any nervousness between you guys and George that he would be facing the lesser charges?
My understanding was that they were confused by a confusing jury instruction. I said to the judge, Mr. West first argued one day, and before I started my closing the next day, that the manslaughter instruction is very confusing. I don't want to get into the legal part of it, and I know you don't, but if you look at it, justifiable homicide is identified within manslaughter, excusable homicide is identified within manslaughter, and somewhere separate is justifiable use of deadly force. If you try and read those, they are logically inconsistent, but not legally inconsistent. And I think that jury, as smart as they are, because they were thinking, looked at it and said, why are you telling us about excusable homicide? It's just that we had to, even though it had no application to the facts of this case. So. Sure.
Hi.
Yamisha.
Hi. Yamisha Sender with USA Today. Don West, you said that I am thrilled that this jury kept this tragedy from becoming a travesty. Can you talk about what the tragedy you're talking about? We talked about civil rights issues here, people not falsely or wrongly linking it to race. Could you just tell me a little bit more what you mean by that tragedy into a travesty?
The tragedy is the loss of Trayvon Martin's life in every respect. Regardless of what he was doing or immediately what led up to it, it's a tragic loss of life. It not only will impact, of course, Trayvon Martin's family and all those that knew him forever and ever. This event itself also impacts George Zimmerman forever and ever and ever. This is something no one gets over. There's no winners here. There's no monsters here. That's the tragedy. The travesty, it would have been a travesty of justice had George Zimmerman been convicted. That's the travesty.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate the time. I think that was, someone said it was the last question.
Unlike what Ms. Corey said, they brought the facts. They didn't. Anybody that watched this trial knew the defense put on the case. We proved George Zimmerman was not guilty. So, no, I won't talk about that. Thank you.
Yes.
Yes, sir. Ben Montgomery, Tampa Bay Times. Can you give us any insight into Mr. Zimmerman's state of mind upon hearing the verdict?
I don't know exactly how you can feel when you're in trauma and stress for 16 months. And he's very, very happy with the result, obviously. There's just a release that happens, an emotion release.
This trial is about George Zimmerman, not about pictures of ice cream cones or... Now, I still think the joke was funny. I'm sorry about that. I'm sorry I didn't tell it better, but there was an important reason for it. There needed to be a disconnect, frankly, a disconnect from an act that was hard to follow. But I knew, Mr. O'Mara knew, and you all soon found out that it was indeed just an act. I couldn't follow that act with that kind of passion and glaring and staring and all of that. We needed facts.
It was some of what, with the enormous demands they put upon us to try and get discovery that in 30 years of experience, on the table right up. It was a fight that we had to fight. They made it extraordinarily difficult. If only we had the time back to fight for the stuff, the information, discovery, result for 6 months ago, and certainly I wouldn't have had the hundreds and hundreds of hours wasted in a situation where they never should have made us waste time. Was it fair? You know, it was a little bit David and Goliath, but we won.
Danny Morales with the Valencia Voice here.
Was this a fair fight for you?
You know, let me say it this way. I need to apologize to every public defender in the state. And for this reason, because I said that the way that we were treated in the discovery process and the fights that we had to go through made me think, thought they were dealing with a couple of young, overworked public defenders, insulted public defenders. And I learned from public defenders, as a prosecutor, that I learned from. So to the extent there, I apologize. What I meant to say was that it seems prosecution is used to getting away, endorphin release and adrenaline release. I think it's probably going to settle on him tonight when he's with his family and can actually realize that he doesn't need to come back to the courthouse tomorrow or ever again unless he wants to under his own free will. So I think he's going to be great. I think he's still worried. And hopefully everyone will respect the jury's verdict as they should, and most have said they would, and we'll take it day by day. But he's doing good.
This is Grace Wong with In Session. I know this is a yes or no question, but I want you to expand on it after I ask the question.